Thank you very much, Janet. Everyone, I am really excited to be here. You may not feel the excitement that I usually exude because I am still struggling with walking pneumonia. So please bear with me a little bit. But that's how excited I am to be here, that I pulled myself out of bed to be at this event. So hopefully that will give you some of my usual excitement. And we have a few questions we're going to ask you that Janet's going to pull up in terms of polls, just to give us an idea of what exactly you're coming in with, what you're looking for. So if you could just take a moment to answer these poll questions for us. And while you're doing that, we can talk a little bit about housekeeping. So what we're going to do is have some short presentations just to kind of get us talking about this topic, and then we want to leave time for questions. So we hope that you'll be thinking about questions throughout this, and you can put them in the chat. And then when we get to the question and answer portion, we will cover those questions to the best of our ability. However, we're talking about doing a part 2 already. So if we don't get to them all, hopefully we can include that in part 2. So please do put anything down you're thinking about. If we can't cover it today, hopefully we'll be able to cover it next time. Great. The votes are pouring in. All right, we're almost to 60%. Oh, 60% voted. Excellent. So I think it's starting to give us an idea. We have about 45% of people who actually have an autoimmune disease. So they're obviously here for themselves, but maybe also for their loved ones. Some people who are at risk for autoimmune disease, it's a small percentage, maybe 10. And then we have some professionals. So we have about 17% are clinicians who work with autoimmune disease, but don't necessarily have a nutrition background. And 25% are nutritionists who work with people with autoimmune disease. So we're really excited to have all of you experts here to help back us up in case we forget anything. So feel free to throw that out there, resources you might use, and of course, all those great questions you're going to be able to think of. And the next question is, have you made any changes in what you eat to help manage your condition? And most of you, 80%, said yes. So that's great that you're already thinking about that. And those of you who haven't, 14%, hopefully we can give you some ideas for starting that. And maybe you are already doing some of them actually. So that'll be interesting to see as well. Let's see. You are all looking for more information about autoimmune disease and nutrition, which is really exciting. We will hopefully be bringing more of that to you. Oh, and you all want to see a podcast on this episode too. So maybe that's another follow-up we can do. We do love our podcast. If you don't subscribe to us, it's the GW Integrative Medicine podcast, just like the logo in Janet's box. And you can get it anywhere you get your podcast, or you can find it on our website, which you can just Google either GW Integrative Medicine or OIMH, the Office of Integrative Medicine Health, OIMH. We are the only OIMH, so that's helpful. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully everybody is settled. I'm just going to give a real brief introduction to the idea of a food-based approach. The idea is you have to eat, first of all, right? So it's a great place to start. Everyone has to eat. Might as well help you. The other thing is with the integrative medicine approach, we really want to use all the tools of our tool belt. So anything that has an evidence base behind it. And nutrition definitely has an evidence base behind it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And the idea is it's not going to be replacing anything you're doing already, right? It's something you can add on to whatever you're doing, or, maybe it'll change the things you're working on with your physician, but the idea is it's not an or, it's an and. So you use this with whatever methods you're already using to amplify them. And obviously, again, you have to eat, so you might as well try it. So that's kind of the idea behind this. Also really want to talk about how diet is generally something that's relatively easy for us to change. We can make small tweaks here and there. So it's not something you have to go ahead and change everything that you're eating. So maybe pick a few items that we're going to talk about today and implement them rather than trying to throw a baby out with the bathwater necessarily. You don't have to do that. So we want you to feel that you can take baby steps, and we're not going to say this is how you have to do it. And if you don't do everything that we say, then it's not going to work. So that's another thing to keep in mind as we have these discussions. And then go ahead and start putting questions as we start our discussion, which is going to start off with Susan. And she's going to present a case study that is going to deal with her patient population, which has a lot of issues with access to food and care. So hopefully this might ring with some of you out there.
Hi, Susan Lillis Shore. I teach at GW, but I also see patients at Whitman Walker Health, where most of our population includes people who don't have easy access to healthcare in many ways. And so the patient I'd like to tell you about, she's now about 38 years old. She first came to me at age 36. She's a young woman who has multiple sclerosis. She had been put on medication for that, but she wanted to establish primary care. She had just gotten health insurance through Affordable Care Act and was able to come in and see someone. And she also wanted to talk about additional modalities, in particular because she wished to become pregnant. And multiple sclerosis, for those of you who are not familiar, is a neuromuscular condition that's, as Dr. Frame mentioned, it starts with inflammation. It's inflammation of the coating of the kind of the wrapping around the nerve. And what that does is when a nerve impulse travels from your brain or spinal cord down the nerve, it's leaping. So you imagine Baryshnikov leaping across the stage, right? And it's this nice smooth surface that the electrons can bounce off of. But if that coating gets messed up, if it gets inflamed, it's just tripping up the dancer, right? And so the nerve impulses go through funny, or they don't go through at all, or they even go through backwards. And it happens in both directions. So it can be sensory problems that you feel funny, or it can be movement problems that you can't get the impulse to move correctly down. Now, all of these diseases that we're talking about have some level of inflammation. And the idea is then to cut inflammation. Well, the backstory on this is I too have multiple sclerosis, and I have had it since age 19, and I am 65 right now. And I'm not going to get up and dance for you, but I could. And a lot of that has been because my disease has very much been controlled with diet, and then gradually, as I was able to exercise and acupuncture and a number of alternative things, I have never taken a medication for MS, because the medications for a lot of these things, they do wonderful things. And I don't know that I'd make that choice now if it were mine to make. It wasn't at the time. But everything else worked so well, why bother, right? Well, this young woman was already on medication. So whatever the medication does is also modulating the immune system. So we want to optimize her function. So how do we optimize our diet? Well, each of us is individual. Sometimes you know, sometimes you don't. But bottom line, more fruits and vegetables, more fruits and vegetables, more fruits and vegetables, right? With some exceptions. I do know that with rheumatoid arthritis, the nightshade family seems to cause problems. You know, so a lot of people find, and this may not be universal, I don't have research on it, but if rheumatoid arthritis is the thing, or actually with many of these things, might be worth a try to cut out potatoes and peppers and tomatoes. I don't know. Laura can give you all the nightshades. I always forget if okra is one or isn't one. But, you know, so nightshades and sugar for that. Well, I tell all my patients to cut out sugar, and almost never works, but most of them will try and at least reduce the amount. You know, so we actually did some of that. She had a very successful pregnancy, had her baby, everything worked fine. Now, the tricky part with MS is it's an over-response to the immune system, as many of these things are. The immune system is repressed when you're pregnant. Otherwise, all of us would spit the baby out way early. It's not us, right? But so very often after the baby is born is when people have problems. So that was the key thing, keeping her nutritional status up after the pregnancy, and then helping to make sure she didn't have a major exacerbation within the couple of months after her little girl was born. So the ending has been good. She's had some regression on the diet. This year has been hard for many people. But, she's still working on it. And that's kind of the bottom line. So my main takeaways are sugar bad, but everybody's going to eat some sugar. So don't worry too much about it. Just keep it to a minimum. And then see if there are foods that for you are problematic. And we know which ones are common problems. And Laura can talk to you some more about that. But, there are some usual suspects that you might try pulling from your diet to see how that works.
Thank you. That was a great introduction. And I think that Lara's case will go into maybe a little bit more details. She tends to work with a population, as many integrative medicine practitioners do. Unfortunately, we're not quite as accessible as we'd like to be, but works with a population that is a little more well off, and they can do the optimum, right? Throw everything at it, and really change their lifestyle completely because they have the ability to do that. So I think she will tell us more about that now.
Yes, but before I do that, I want to just color in a little bit too, and just back up to order to understand why we are approaching things the way we're approaching them. I think it's important to maybe set a foundation as to why we're doing that. So I'm going to back up a little bit, and I'm actually going to share my screen, and I've got a couple of slides that I think visually can help us all get on the same page. So this is this is how I view the balance between the way we typically look at autoimmune disease from a conventional perspective versus the functional or systems-based perspective, right? And the idea is on the left side of the screen, actually, let me start on the right side of the screen where you see a symptom-based approach. Unfortunately, with autoimmune disease, a lot of what we're doing is sort of chasing the rabbit, right? A symptom pops up, we use a medication to mitigate it. It helps that person have a better quality of life. It helps that person feel better, but it doesn't necessarily change the progression of that autoimmune disease. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is for a period of time that intervention might work, then eventually the immune system overpowers that mechanism, and we end up seeing a regression in symptoms, and we've got to switch agents or find another alternative. This is what we call a downstream approach. Again, it's chasing the rabbit. The rabbit's already gotten out of the cage, and now we're just running around the yard trying to get a hold of it. Good luck with that, right? On the left side of the screen, we have what we call a systems-based approach based on the systems medicine or functional medicine. This is instead trying to backtrack why we have that autoimmune imbalance, why that autoimmune condition has shown up, and then trying to address those imbalances at the root cause. And that's what we call an upstream approach. That's not opening the cage and letting the rabbit out to begin with, right? So it's a little bit more of a deeper dive into the potential drivers, the potential mechanisms, the potential triggers of that autoimmune disease. So these vocabulary words, particularly upstream, downstream, you'll hear a lot in these discussions about functional medicine, the food-based approach to whether it be autoimmune disease or any disease. So I just wanted to introduce them here in case folks weren't familiar with them. And then I want to show you this. So these are I think there's 7 of them, drivers that I typically think of when I think of autoimmune disease. So autoimmune disease, whether it be Hashimoto's, Crohn's, RA, MS, whatever it is, it's an imbalance of the immune system that is impacting some particular tissue or combination of tissues or cells, and that is causing the particular kind of autoimmune disease that we're dealing with. So when it's Hashimoto's, it's impacting the thyroid and the thyroid hormones. When it's Crohn's, it's impacting the colon. When it's RA, it's impacting the joint tissues, right? But the essence of it, the crux of it is that immune imbalance. And there are multiple factors that impact that balance of the immune system. Big, huge, first and foremost is your GI integrity and your microbiome balance. I see applause from Lee. I feel like she has words. I see Susan, you see you as well. Big, big piece of this picture. And I think, and Lee, I'd love to, I'm going to go through this and I'd love to circle back to that GI piece, because this is, I think, a very big piece that in the conventional picture is being missed, right? We are not adequately addressing that as that root cause, as that upstream reason as to why we're all of a sudden seeing this increase in autoimmune disease, right? Second would be nutritional status. If you are not either eating enough of those nutrients, or our food supply is depleted of those nutrients, or your microbiome and GI integrity piece is altering your ability to absorb those nutrients from your diet, you're going to then have an imbalance of nutrients that are then supposed to be responsible for creating a balance in your immune system, but they're not quite there. They're not able to create that balance. Third is going to be whether or not there are other things altering your immune response, your overall ability to have good immune balance. That could be due to hormonal factors. That could be due to stress factors. That could be due to recurring allergies, whether it be seasonal allergies, environmental allergies, food reactivities, or it could be due to chronic infections. We know a lot of autoimmune disease might be actually triggered by viral infections. And there's been a lot of research around EBV, Epstein-Barr, COV, cytomegalomy, et cetera, those could potentially be these chronic lingering viral infections that could be triggered. And interestingly enough, just a couple weeks ago, Dr. Vajanis and et al. And Dr. Karazian, there's two Vajanis and a Karazian on that paper, published about COVID potentially being an autoimmune trigger as well. A fascinating article. I think that's going to open up a whole slew of research around the impact of viral infections, chronic infections, and autoimmune disease. So I think it's important to understand this, because once you sort of start to wrap your head around these predisposing factors, these mitigating factors, then you can start to see how you can have these potential triggers why one person might develop autoimmune disease and somebody might not, right? And typically I look for one of these four categories. Do they have any sort of dysbiosis, chronic infection, whether it be viral or Lyme or other? Do they have any obvious...
Real quick, Clara, what's dysbiosis?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for slowing me down there. Dysbiosis is when your microbiome, your balance of good bacteria and bad bacteria is out of whack. That could mean not having enough of the good guys, having too much of the bad guys, or a combination of both. And that could be, that's a whole fascinating, oh my gosh, that needs its own like webinar, actually. Mental note. It could be food intolerances or reactions, and that could be an outright allergy, or it could be just a sensitivity or reactivity to any kind of food. And there's multiple reasons why that could occur. It could be exposures to different environmental toxins, whether it be plastics or heavy metals or pesticides, et cetera, or it could be physical or psychological stress or trauma. Being in a car accident is just as traumatizing to the body as having a death in the family, if somebody or a friend that passes away, right? The stress that we experienced last year from COVID, that is also a trauma. We're going to be, I think, unraveling a lot of people's traumatic experiences, stressors, etc. And I wouldn't be surprised if a combination of viral exposure and stress and financial hardship and emotional loss is going to also be part of potential triggers down the line. So no better time to be having this conversation than now. And then last but not least, I really want to drive home this point. I know, Lee, we've talked about this. The idea of immune adaptation. I often hear folks talking about immune boosting. I often hear folks talking about, making sure that the immune system is strong enough, right? but it's not about strength of the immune system. Think of the immune system as a symphony. Actually, yes, think of the immune system as a symphony. And in the case of autoimmune disease, it's a middle school band. Okay? Yes, exactly. That's what it sounds like, a middle school band. The sections are not playing at the same time. They're out of tune. Somebody's absent because they're sick. You're missing whole parts of the section because they're like not paying attention. That's the immune system, essentially. The various parts of the immune system, the various arms of the immune system are not in sync. They're not playing correctly together. And so it sounds horrible. It looks horrible. It's a mess. What we really want to strive for is a balance, right? What we want is to be able to uplift the sounds that are working and maybe dampen the sounds that aren't doing so good, right? And we want to make sure that those arms are actually playing together in symphony, in unison, so that it sounds like a professional orchestra, right? And so that sometimes means more of utilizing interventions that work more synergistically, that work more adaptively. And that's actually why sometimes the food-based approach and the botanical approach is actually better than the pharmaceutical approach, because pharmaceutical approach tends to do one thing. It's a one-trick pony. It only focuses on that middle, the dampening. It calms down the inflammatory response in order to keep the flare from happening, but it doesn't do anything about balancing. It doesn't do anything to boost the parts that need to be boosted. And so what you end up is sort of further creating that cacophony, further regressing that orchestral sound. And that's why you end up seeing then that pharmaceutical eventually fail, and then we got to move into another pharmaceutical. And that's why you see some of the side effects, right? That's why you see folks, they get sick more often, they're more fragile, they're not able to take certain, they're not able to be, for example, to take certain vaccines, or they're not able to take other medications because it increases their potential risk because their immune system has been dampened. So I think these are important foundational pieces. I see some chatter happening in the chat box. I can't see the chat box right now, but I'm sure there's some great stuff going on in there. Before I jump into sort of talking about that case, Lee, do you want to jump in with some more about the microbiome piece?
Sure, absolutely. And I see there is some great chat going on there. And Julie is one of our faculty members and who actually was going to pinch hit for me today. So thanks for that great question, which we will definitely discuss. So hold on to that. But the microbiome, so, we didn't know there was a microbiome, right? We didn't know that we had these healthy bacteria, fungi, viruses, archaea living on us and in us. And now that we do, what we're finding out is they're basically half of us. And so we were ignoring half of the ecosystem that is us. So obviously what we were doing previously is not always going to work because we were only looking at a portion of us. And now when we have an integrative approach and we know about things about the microbiome, we can add that other half back in. And a lot of times it reinforces what we were already saying. Like with a microbiome, what we hear over and over again is you need a lot of different kinds of plants. That seems to be like the one thing that really comes over and over again. The more diverse your diet, the better. Make sure you're getting enough fiber. If you don't think you're getting enough fiber, you're not. Make sure you're getting enough fiber. So in some ways, it's really confirmed the things that we know and maybe placing more of an emphasis on those than we previously did. We all knew we should eat our vegetables, but it wasn't such an imperative as it is now that we see what happens with the microbiome and then related diseases like autoimmunity. The other thing is we're seeing that there are certain members of that microbiome community that are more important than others. And some people are lacking them or they don't have enough of them. And we have to figure out how we can support, very similar to the symphony, right? The microbiome is a symphony as well. It's an ecosystem. They're all interacting with each other, interacting with us. So if anybody's missing from that group, it kind of throws it off a little bit and we need to figure out how to restore them. The science is still coming on that, but there are a few key ones that we know you absolutely need to have already. For instance, Rheumatococcus bromii. Don't worry about the name, but we know that it's key to the digestion of resistant starch, which is fiber. So if you don't have this one bug, you basically don't digest the fiber the way that you should, and you don't get the health benefits of having a high fiber diet. So now you could see where a diet-based approach is important, but if you're giving your gut fiber and you don't have Rheumacoccus bromii, then you're not digesting that fiber and you're not getting the health benefits. So you have to kind of look at the whole system to really get those benefits, or everything you're doing with food isn't going to fully be realized. Anything else? I think that kind of sums it up.
If I may, I just wanted to touch on the issue of stress that Lara also mentioned, because again, with my population, that's a huge issue, because financial stress, if you're already poor, is first of all chronic, but is worsened by things like you must eat right now, because frankly, healthy food is more expensive. So a lot of what we end up doing is talking about how you can find healthy food that is inexpensive and often in your backyard.
Yes, Susan is always telling us to eat our dandelions. They're free greens, and if you are growing them properly, they'll be organic.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to the larger systemic issue of food access, right? I think what we're talking about there is honestly the public health crisis that makes being healthy, that makes the status quo unhealthy rather than the status quo to be healthy. And that is essentially the systemic top-down problem. If we're talking about the upstream approach, that's the crux of the issue. Yeah. Do you want me to go ahead and jump into this case? Because I think it's a perfect segue, because as you said before, my population tends to be able to pay out of pocket to come see me at my clinic, right? And I love what I'm able to do. And I love to be able to allow for a space for us to do deeper testing and for them to be able to do a ton of supplements and to do all this stuff. And it's sort of a kind of a petri dish, a perfect example of what you could do if things can be done perfectly. What I hope that we can extrapolate from this is not so much that you have to do this exact protocol or you have to do exactly what this person did, but rather that you could see that if we can wave a wand and if we can sort of pick from these things, what can we pull and utilize, as you said so beautifully before. So it doesn't mean you have to do it all tomorrow, but are there pieces of this that you can incorporate that are accessible and useful for you? Excuse me. So we're going to call her Ellen, not her real name. Ellen came to me a few years ago with a diagnosis of lupus. She was about 41 years old at the time. And she had had her lupus diagnosis for about 5 or 6 years at that point. Very frustrating story of how it took a really long time for her to get the diagnosis. And I see Suzanne smiling because that happens all the time, the misdiagnosis. And that's a whole other topic for another day. When she finally got her diagnosis, she was put on prednisone by her rheumatologist, and it was more or less managed. Now, she still had flares of pain, and most significantly, she was having a lot of GI distress at the time, a lot of diarrhea, dominant IBS type symptoms. But she has had IBS almost her entire adult life. Since 1998, we put her about 20 years old, she had had IBS. And that was something that was sort of never addressed and sort of brushed aside as just something that she deals with, and she just has to be careful what she eats. But it really planted the seed in her mind that she couldn't eat right before a meeting. She couldn't eat right before she had to sit with somebody. So she would skip meals all the time in an effort to avoid that awkward running to the bathroom in the middle of her workday. She also had a lot of significant stress leading up to her diagnosis. She was a college student, then in grad school, on a ramen diet, basically, watching her pennies throughout that. Was the primary caretaker for her mother as her mother became ill. And so when you draw out her timeline, there's a very clear correlation between the stress and her diagnosis of lupus. She's also currently experiencing bone loss. And I'm not going to get too much into the bone loss, but I wanted to mention it because we often see that especially in women, especially as they approach perimenopause, shifts in hormones that both impact bone matrix health and the strength of their bones, as well as their immune and potential immune dysregulation. So I just wanted to mention that as a component of it, because it comes up often enough that I think it's worth saying. When we did her dietary assessment, she reported to us that she often never feels hungry. Likely she's trained her body to sort of skip meals, and she doesn't really feel hungry. And she's associated food with pain, discomfort, and running to the bathroom. She's also often in a lot of physiological and musculoskeletal and joint pain. So she's also in pain, and so that doesn't really give her an appetite to want to sit down and eat. She noticed that eating vegetables, particularly raw vegetables, would trigger some of her symptoms. So she tended to sort of stay away from vegetables in general, although would say, I should be eating more vegetables, but it just hurts when I eat too many. And she would get really bad gas, and it was something she'd had for a really long time. She's like, people just don't want to be around me, because her gas was so just very foul smelling and very offensive, and of course embarrassing. So what does she do then? Continue to avoid vegetables and continue to avoid eating in order to avoid that that negative social stigma. She tried going vegetarian for a while, and when I hear folks tell me that they tried a trial of vegetarian eating, I often start to ask what the motivation for that is. And the reason I ask is because I've found that folks sometimes will try going vegetarian because they don't enjoy meat, not necessarily for the ethical or the taste reasons, but because they physically don't feel well when they eat it. And that can often give me a clue as to whether or not they're able to break down protein adequately. And so I'll ask whether or not they felt like things were sitting in their stomach after they've eaten a high protein meal, especially like if it was red meat versus chicken versus fish. And very often, not always, but very often they'll say, yeah, it just never really felt good. And so it was easy to give up. I didn't feel good eating. It just sat like a brick, or my gas got worse, or I would get cramping or bloating afterwards. And so that's a really great clue that there's actually some deficiency in hydrochloric acid, or the betaine that is produced in the stomach that helps us to primarily break down protein, but it's like the domino that helps the rest of the digestive tract along. It helps to promote motility. It helps to promote the production of other digestive enzymes as well. And if that's deficient, often then you're going to see some of those nutrient deficiencies occurring as well. And her bowel movements, as I mentioned before, she was prone towards that diarrhea subset of IBS. She would go multiple times a day. And she reported, again, a lot of gas, bloating, not necessarily just around the time of those bowel movements, but it definitely was associated with it as well. So what this triggered to me was that she likely was a Sibo sufferer. She is, I think, somebody that has probably had, and I see somebody put in the chat, FODMAP, dysbiosis. Absolutely. She's probably somebody that had Sibo, and this was the first encounter, and I'm sort of sitting there going, sounds like a Sibo, but walks like a duck, talks like a duck. It's probably a duck. And IBS, we more recently have been seeing more evidence connecting Sibo with IBS, and that IBS might actually have some of its roots in the dysbiosis that's associated with Sibo. And so that sort of was the direction I started to go in when I was addressing her GI, that GI piece with her. Now, luckily for her, I was able to do some pretty extensive testing with her. She had the financial ability to do some additional testing. So we did a Sibo breath test. We did some stool testing. We did a comprehensive nutrition evaluation, and we also did some food sensitivity testing at the time. Mostly I did the food sensitivity testing because she was already limited in what she was eating. I didn't want to further restrict her if it was unnecessary, but I also wanted to make sure I was addressing anything that might be potentially creating some of the problem. And we did find some significant IgG food sensitivity. So not true allergies, not true IgE allergies, but some significant IgG sensitivities to dairy and eggs. And that really helped her really get on board with removing those two foods. We also removed gluten at the time because she had some mild reactivity to gluten. And there was a lot of random other food reactions that she was experiencing, which gave me a clue that there might be some intestinal permeability happening and some inflammation happening in her gut. Her stool testing confirmed that. She definitely showed some evidence of localized inflammation. She had a marker called secretory IgA, which was actually very, very elevated, which is typically, it elevates initially when there's a lot of food reactivity, and then sometimes it nosedives later. But we had caught it when it had significantly elevated. Usually that's a clue that there is some food reactivity happening and that we're looking at a potential intestinal permeability or leaky gut picture. And she showed signs of multiple dysbiosis, both low beneficial bacteria as well as some opportunistic overgrowths that were occurring. As well as inadequate amounts of what are called short chain fatty acids, which are some of the byproducts of fermentation that occur when you have a good balance of good and bad bacteria. She was very positive for Sibo. My hunch was correct. She was a hydrogen dominant form of Sibo. And her nutrition evaluation showed some significant nutritional deficiencies, especially in protein. Her amino acid profile was very depleted. She had some depletions in her essential fatty acids, meaning she was not appropriately absorbing those nutrients and or not eating enough because, again, it was causing discomfort for her to eat them. And some other vitamin and mineral deficiencies, particularly B vitamins and fat-soluble vitamins. And then there was some concern about elevations in aluminum, arsenic, and cadmium in her blood. Now, when I see osteopenia, when I see bone loss, sometimes I'm looking specifically for lead leaching from the bone. Luckily, in her case, that wasn't occurring. But think about this picture from that picture that I shared with you before about the various components of what might trigger or contribute towards autoimmune disease. You've got a dysbiosis, you've got a GI integrity issue, you've got multiple nutritional depletions, right? You've got bugs, right? She's got some actual bugs that are occurring, those bacteria that are overgrowing in her gut. And she's got the stress component, right? And so for her, she really was hitting on sort of all those aspects. So, and I sort of want to bring that back to our forefront of our thinking, that we couldn't just do one thing. You might pick one thing and start there. Somebody mentioned before, peeling the onion. You might pick one thing and focus on that, but you eventually have to kind of circle around to all the things, right? And with her, we chose to start with the Sibo piece. We used some antimicrobials. We addressed that piece through various antimicrobials. We used what's called the 5R approach. We knocked out some of the dysbiosis. We walked her through doing some digestive enzymes and bitters and betaine, and then we did some healing and sealing of the gut to address that. I'm not going to go too deep into that because that's its own webinar, but that we did do that piece. From a food perspective, from a foundational perspective, I started her on what's called a Walls protocol. So Dr. Terry Walls, I saw somebody mention her in the chat as well. And Dr. Terry Walls' protocol is a 3-step. It's a 3-layered approach. There's level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1 is sort of the basic foundational. Level 2 is more of a paleo. And level 3 is your keto aspect. Keto is phenomenal in terms of, I find it very useful for folks that are in pain. I find it very useful for folks with like more rheumatic symptoms because it has an anti-inflammatory effect, but it's not for everybody. And in her case, we couldn't do that. It was just too much of a jump for her. She wasn't ready to go that far. So we settled on the level 2, the paleo approach. Now, some of the big aspects of Walls, which I think are what really make it so powerful. It's not so much the removal of things. Yes, you're removing lectins. Yes, you're removing some of the inflammatory foods like the gluten and the dairy. And in her case, we removed egg, soy, etc. Yes, we are doing, the removal of some of those inflammatory triggering foods. In her case, by the way, Suzanne, we did not take out nightshades. We didn't seem to need to. So mixed bag, where sometimes it works like gangbusters and sometimes it doesn't. This was a case it really didn't help her. But the real heart of the Walls protocol, it's its emphasis on certain nutrients and the way she categorizes them. So she recommends 3 servings of leafy greens, 3 servings of the sulfur-rich cruciferous vegetables and the alliums. And alliums are like your garlic and your leeks and your onions, etc. And your cruciferous vegetables are your broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbages, the stinky ones, the ones that you stick in the oven and like stinks up the whole house like eggs. Those are your cruciferous vegetables. It's a dead giveaway. And then the third category are colorful, a variety of colorful fruits and vegetables to fit in there. And the idea there is if you sort of address those 3 components, you get that, you get like 9 servings of those in. You're really crowding in all the various minerals, vitamins, essential fats, fiber, and phytonutrients. And those phytonutrients that come from the color, that come from that variety, are going to do a couple of different things. They're going to modulate the immune response in a favorable way. They're going to create balance, and they're going to also help support the microbiome as well. So you're sort of getting a 1-2 punch with that approach.
Lara, may I interject quickly?
Yeah, please.
I think that what you're saying may confuse some people, particularly we've already had the mention of FODMAPs, because a lot of the things that you just said, like alliums, garlic, onions, they are absolute no-no in FODMAPs.
Yes.
So how can we have something like that and something like FODMAPs be beneficial to autoimmune diseases?
I'm so glad you said that. So that's a great point. So what we've done is we created a walls with a FODMAP, right? So FODMAPs aren't in or out. It's a dial. And some people have actually more tolerance towards certain FODMAPs than others. And so what we do is we work with that person and we say, okay, here are the real big guns. To your point, the alliums, right? The garlic, the onion, legumes, et cetera. Those are usually the big no-nos, and those are big triggers for folks with Sibo. And what we'll do is we'll initially remove them so that we can get some control of the symptoms. Once we walk through that 5-hour protocol, once we address the dysbiosis with the antimicrobial approach, you get that rebalance of the gut microbiome. And now we start to reintroduce those FODMAPs gradually, slowly, turning up the dial, gradually putting them back in. Their tolerance improves and they're able to eat them again. There's also a couple tricks around this. For example, garlic, it's the fiber in the garlic, not the juice of the garlic that's a problem. Same with onion. So you can actually take a whole garlic, slice it up really big, put it in an oil, heat up the oil, remove the garlic. The oil now tastes like garlic. Your food now tastes like garlic, but you didn't have any of the fiber, right? You could infuse the garlic in an olive oil and set it aside as well. So you get the infusion into the oil, right? Or you can squeeze the oil of the garlic into the food without actually having the fiber. Take the fiber out, just get the juice out and use that in like a salad or something like that. So there's a few tricks that we'll usually use.
And I also just wanted to mention that particularly cruciferous vegetables and the alliums are cheap as all get out.
Yep.
You know, you can buy a big bag of kale or a big bag, a couple nice sized cabbages for almost nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Great point. Great point. Accessible and useful. What I find is challenging is folks that have been avoiding for a long time is that getting used to the strong flavor from them if they're not used to them anymore, and sort of coaching them on how to prepare them. That usually becomes the challenge there. And then aside from that, other focuses of her plan was using bone broth. We have a low FODMAP recipe for bone broth that we recommend. So to sort of cut back on, back on the garlic and the onions and stuff like that. We also made sure to focus her in on healthy fats, the anti-inflammatory fats coming from sources like nuts, seeds, avocado or avocado oil, olive oil, fish. And then I also usually recommend for my clients to use ghee, which is clarified butter, because of the butyric acid that's in it, because of the vitamin A that's in it, and because it's clarified, if they have a dairy sensitivity, I'm not worried about that. And that's also another great way, whether they make it or buy it, that's another great, easy way to improve those short chain fatty acids, as well as to help regulate that vitamin A is an important component of that balance of the immune system.
I'm going to jump in again. So for those of you who don't know, short chain fatty acids are what we know of now as the most important product from the microbiome. So your gut microbiome, it digests fiber and produces short chain fatty acids, which literally feeds the cells of your gut. The cells of your gut need those short chain fatty acids to survive. And that's why you see a lot of leaky gut in these patients that don't have a healthy gut microbiome, because they're not there to make those short chain fatty acids. And when Lara mentioned butyric acid, that is one of those short chain fatty acids. So basically, it's kind of like a shortcut to get around the microbiome. You're delivering it to the gut. Now, it's not really a long-term solution, and it's definitely not ideal. It's much better to have the gut microbiome make it right where it's needed, but at least you can kind of start moving in that direction.
Absolutely, especially for those folks that can't tolerate a lot of fiber. So it's like, okay, well, I can't give you fiber, a prebiotic, to help feed those bacteria. So I'm just going to give you the product, which is the butyric acid. And I have not quite had as much success. I know there are supplements out there, and for the professionals that are on this call, if you've had positive experience, I'd love to hear it. But I haven't seen as much beneficial experience from supplementing butyric acid as opposed to getting it from ghee. And then I get the added benefit, especially if they're able to get grass-fed, I get the added benefit of that beneficial fat as well. And then a couple of last things, a note on hydration, just making sure that she's hydrating adequately. And sometimes part of that hydration plan might be using lemon and apple cider vinegar to help to make the digestion piece, so to further support the digestion piece. And then also sometimes using herbs and teas, things like ginger, turmeric, rosemary, chamomile, pomegranate, all have these phytonutrient benefits that help not only locally in the gut, but systemically help to modulate the immune system and balance the immune system, as well as have some anti-inflammatory activity that could be beneficial for pain. Although in her case, we relied on a lot of nutraceuticals. We did use some specific supplements to target the pain piece of her lupus, as well as balancing her immune system.
That's great. I think we covered a lot there. So I'm going to go ahead and go back and look at some of these questions that we have, and we'll try and address as many of them as we can.
I want to...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Julie made a really good point about low FODMAP being not a great long-term solution. I second that.
Yeah, that's a really important point to make. And I think that is something that people get confused about, because they think, oh, I have to be on a low FODMAP diet, but it's just a short-term tool to fix the problems that are there. And then we want to reintroduce those foods, because otherwise your microbiome is going to starve. So
I just wanted to touch on, people list a lot of different conditions that they wanted us to speak to. Crohn's, and I believe ulcerative colitis, myasthenia gravis, Hashimoto's, rheumatoid and psoriatic arthritis, hypothyroid and endometriosis, and osteoarthritis. Now, I will mention that osteoarthritis is not usually considered to be an inflammatory condition. It's really more mechanical, at least in the Western medical sense. And I don't know if others have a different thought about that. But the other ones, these approaches, nothing's universal. It always has to be personalized to the individual. But I have not found any of them that do not respond well to the kinds of things we've been talking about, which is getting a balance and a far fuller intake of fruits and vegetables. And to my mind, particularly vegetables.
That's a great point. And someone actually asked, what do you do if you don't like fruits and vegetables? Is there a substitute? And I'm thinking, no, there is no substitute. They do have supplements that you can take, but and there are some that are actually not bad. They're literally freeze-dried fruits and vegetables. So you are getting the whole food matrix, which is part of the importance of eating it. However, there's a lot of benefits to eating food that we don't fully understand. Some of it actually occurs in the mouth. For instance, not that this is necessarily relevant here, but red wine, if you hold it in your mouth, you absorb things differently than you do if you just chug it back. So if you're at a wine tasting, you are actually getting some health benefits, but if you're chugging a bottle because you're in college or something, then you're not getting those health benefits. So the idea of taking a pill might not replace it, even if you are getting this whole food that's been freeze-dried.
But I will say, working a lot with people who've been raised on McDonald's, and I do mean 3 meals a day McDonald's. Mm-hmm. I work a lot with people saying, I don't like it. They hate the taste of water. No, you don't like DC tap water. Get a filter.
Rightly so.
It's a lot cheaper than buying Deer Park or whatever. But I talk a lot about making soups. Soups are much more digestible. So a lot of times it's just, I was talking to a homeless man one time. I came in to see him and he was really, really angry. And I couldn't figure out why he was so angry. And I finally said, what's going on? And he said, oh, the nutritionist caught me in the waiting room while I was waiting for you. And I said, oh, and she told you all these things that you can't do. And he said, right, do you know what's in my kitchen? And it was right after Thanksgiving. I said, yes, several cans of pumpkin and some cranberry sauce. And he said, yes, because that's what people give. to the food bank. And so I started talking to him about pumpkin soup recipes. And he ended up going to DC Central Kitchen, becoming a chef, and getting a job in a home. So nutrition can save lives.
There you go. You're just full of inspiration today, Susan. You always are.
But I will say, so for many people who don't like vegetable soups and spices, you can make it taste very different than you think.
Great. We got a question here from Julie Wendt. How do you help patients navigate the impact of stress on gut and immune function and the likelihood that diet and lifestyle changes can be super stressful, especially with the all or none perspectives on what foods may be problematic?
I hate all or none perspectives.
I do too.
So I think to make it less stressful, it's baby steps. It's like anything. What do you want right now? And people find when they start changing, they start feeling better, and that's self-reinforcing. So we find one thing. What's one thing you can do?
Agreed. And I think that with the integrative approach, one of the things we really focus on is working with the patient. And I think by having it be a collaboration and be a team partnership, that helps reduce the stress as well, because you're working with them and within their lifestyle, something that will work. And then if they're making suggestions, then hopefully it's something they've already kind of bought into a little bit and you're not pushing them too far. So I think that's another really important piece.
Yeah, I think it's regardless. I think the all or nothing mentality, I don't think serves anybody any good. And I've been seeing more and more cases, especially in the population I work with, of this orthorexic restrictive eating. If I don't eat perfectly, I did something bad kind of mentality. And I think that could be damaging long-term, and that could impact our relationship with food long-term for various reasons. And I think at the end of the day, I believe that we are meant to thrive on diversity. So anything that really puts us into corners, that paints us a certain way, that like says, if you eat this, you can't eat that, you have to eat this way, I think ultimately does us a disservice and doesn't help. That said, I do think that there are cases where we're looking for a very direct line, a therapeutic approach, something to manage and get through a symptom while we find a solution. And in those cases, I think there is space for a therapeutic diet. There's space for a therapeutic intervention. And I think my case is what highlights that, right? In her case, she was in pain. She was frustrated. She needed a solution. It was going to take 2 to 3 months to really get the Sibo piece under control, which was a lot of the driver of her inflammation, a lot of the driver of her autoimmune disease. And if I didn't use some form of the low FODMAP plan to manage her symptoms, she was not going to be very happy, even though eventually she probably would have felt better. But again, I can't emphasize enough, the moving towards expansion, the moving towards diversity was really important. And for her, it was also revisiting her relationship with food. Did she get anxiety every time she sat down to a meal? Was in the back of her head there still a concern she was going to have to run to the bathroom? Even months after those diarrhea symptoms went away, she was still, what if today's the day I eat something and I've got to run out in the middle of this client session, right? And so for her, that was another piece. Remember I said, you got to sort of work your way through all those pieces. For her, dealing with that food trauma, dealing with her relationship with food was really important as well.
That's great. Thank you. One question I think that we should probably address here is someone is asking about plant-based diet for autoimmunity, referencing Dr. Sarah Stancic, who I have seen speak. And I think one point I want to make, well, first, we should refer you to our previous webinar on the plant-based diet, so that Lara and I did. So refer back to that one. We'll include that in the email we're going to send out after this, which also is going to include some resources for you all to reference, because I know there's a lot of information we're talking about today. But I think the issue with saying, plant-based diet for autoimmunity is that may not work for everyone, right? So what we're talking about here is personalization. So while that clearly worked for Dr. Stancic, maybe it wouldn't work for you. But that's where you have to kind of try things and listen to your body. And obviously working with an integrative practitioner will be helpful, but the number one thing is always listening to your body, whether you're the patient or you're working with a patient. Their individual response is going to be just that. It's going to be individual and unique. And part of that is actually due to their microbiome, because everyone's microbiome is unique. So that's something we haven't mentioned, very important. Everyone in this room has a different microbiome. The exact composition is slightly different, which makes it somewhat difficult to figure out how do we get you to your best microbiome, because we currently have no definition for what a healthy microbiome is. So we can't like move you towards this known healthy microbiome. But what we can do is, we know that certain key players, like I mentioned, Rheumacoccus bromii, you absolutely need them. They need to be there. And we can look at those, or what we can do is fix things that we see are wrong, right? Fix things in the diet, fix things right, and then see how it changes. That's probably a healthier microbiome. And as we see that evolve, we can watch that. But I know one of the questions was about, do you test the gut microbiome and what test are you using? And I will be the first person to say that we are not quite there yet. There's a lot of great companies out there that are trying to make this a reality. We just don't have enough information to be this precise yet, but we can look at how it changes, how it evolves, and some of these keystone species. But what I say a lot to my students is, would it change what you did, right? Would it change the plan that you came up for the patient? Or if you're the patient, would it change how you would approach your diet? And if it doesn't, is it really something worth spending a fair amount of money on? That's a big question. And obviously in Susan's patient, that wouldn't be appropriate at all to spend money on those types. But in Lara's case, maybe it's a great way for her to convince her patient that they need to make a change, or show the patient that, look, these changes are actually doing something. And it could be motivating. So yes, you can use those tools, but think carefully about how you're using them and why you want to use those tools. And full disclosure, I am working with a company to create exactly what you just said, but it doesn't exist yet. So.
And we're not sure what it'll mean when it does exist. That's
right.
Research that's ongoing. It's very exciting research. It's going on all across the country. But we do know that the more diverse your intake, the better your microbiome in terms of diversity within. Certain factors, infections and things can mess it up. And certainly taking antibiotics in most cases will make changes. So whenever you have to do that, and I know there are times one must, you have to think about recreating the normal microbiome in there.
That's a great point, Susan. And I think the great news about that is the gut microbiome is actually pretty resilient. So if you're on a short-term course of antibiotics, 7 to 14 days, something like that, don't worry too much. Go back to your diet, give it the fiber and the different plants that it needs, and it will bounce back. It's really the long-term exposure to things that we're really concerned about when you're not giving it the time to bounce back, which it can happen with diet, right? So if you go on these FODMAP diets for 6 months or a year, you've kind of started to starve your microbiome, and to get it back to where it was before that might be difficult. Maybe that wasn't healthy anyway, but still you may have lost some species there that were important and you did want to stay. So I think it's about how long your exposure to everything is. That's just as important. And I see we are running out of time. So if anyone wants to have a few last minute comments before we wrap up.
Can I jump in here, because there's a great discussion going on here. Somebody commented that the issue being that a lot of these diets emphasize meat consumption over vegetable consumption. Maybe I'm misreading the question, but essentially saying that the meat consumption is the focus. I actually disagree that it's the focus. It makes it very challenging for somebody to be vegetarian, for sure. For example, because FODMAP essentially removes legumes and even some nuts, it makes it challenging to sort of get that wide spectrum of amino acids in. But there are ways, and I've designed plans that were vegetarian in those populations. The problem is that when we're talking about a therapeutic intervention, omission of animal-based proteins starts to create issues with the mitochondria, with the energy machinery of the cells, because of the restrictions on those particular nutrients are in there, because it's hard to get enough nutrient density from the other non-animal-based sources. And that then tends to drive some of the immune imbalances. I've actually seen mitochondrial issues, that deficiency in those nutrients, not necessarily because they were vegetarian, just because they ate a terrible diet or not a great diet, that then drives autoimmunity or allergic issues in their immune system. So I think there is a way to do it. I think it is just very challenging, and I don't think it's doable without some supplementation. You have to then rely on a protein source. I just wanted to clarify that because I think that's a very valid concern. We don't want them to just be eating meat on a plate. That's definitely not what we want to go for.
Agreed. And I think that maybe that's just how it's presented in, say, the media, because you can absolutely be a paleo vegan, right? In fact, I know people who are.
Yep.
So just because you're following a certain type of dietary pattern doesn't mean you can't be, low meat, no meat, lacto-ovo, vegetarian, or any of those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I think we are going to sign off here. Thank you so much for joining us. I think you all enjoyed it as much as we did. And stay tuned for a follow-up email, which will have more information, some resources for you. And then also stay tuned for a follow-up event, because we are definitely going to do one. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.